Welcome to Soft Contact. We hope this story helps you rest easy tonight, wherever you are. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is there, and what you think about this topic. Tonight we're gathering accounts from people who saw something they couldn't explain, and then received visitors they couldn't forget. These are memories passed along quietly, stored in notebooks, recorded on answering machines, written in letters that were never sent. Each one describes the same strange courtesy, the same unsettling precision. The men who arrive after you've seen too much, the ones who knock politely and already know your name. Chapter 1. The knock at the door. I remember the sound more than anything else. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, not loud but somehow insistent. It was after midnight, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. I'd been sitting in my kitchen going over what I'd seen earlier that week. The lights moving over the ridge behind my property, silent and geometric. I had written everything down in a notebook, trying to make sense of it. When the knocking came, I felt my stomach drop before I even stood up. The hallway light was off. I could see the shape of someone through the frosted glass panel beside my front door, tall, perfectly still. I asked who it was, and a man's voice said my full name. Not a question, a statement. He said it the way a doctor reads from a chart. I opened the door because I couldn't think of a reason not to, even though every part of me wanted to leave it closed. He wore a black suit, narrow lapels, perfectly pressed. His shirt was white and his tie was black and thin. His shoes reflected the porch light. He was pale in a way that seemed intentional, like stage makeup, and his hair was combed back so neatly it looked painted on. He smiled, but only with his mouth. He asked if he could come in to discuss what I had observed. He used that word, observed. Not seen, not witnessed. Observed. I let him in. I don't know why. He moved past me into the hallway and stopped exactly 3 feet inside, waiting for me to close the door. When I did, he asked if we could sit down. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but it had no variation. Every word carried the same weight. We sat in my living room and he placed a briefcase on his lap. Though he never opened it, he asked me to describe the lights. I did. He nodded after each sentence, but he didn't blink. Not once during the entire conversation. After maybe 10 minutes, he stood, thanked me for my time, and told me it would be best if I didn't discuss what I had seen with anyone else. He said it gently, like a suggestion between friends. Then he left. I watched through the window as he walked to a black car parked at the curb. The interior light never came on when he opened the door. The engine made a sound I'd never heard before, a low hum, and then he was gone. I went back to my notebook and found that 2 pages had been torn out, clean edges. I don't remember him touching it. It was a Tuesday afternoon when they came to my apartment. I know because I'd just gotten home from my shift at the hospital, still in scrubs, and I was exhausted. I told one person about what I saw. One, a friend at work during lunch 2 days earlier. I described the object I'd filmed on my phone while driving home late one night, the way it hovered above the tree line, rotating slowly, completely silent. She left it off. I didn't bring it up again. The knock was soft, apologetic almost. I checked the peephole and saw 2 men standing side by side in the hallway, both in dark suits, both with their hands folded in front of them. They looked like missionaries or funeral directors. I cracked the door open with the chain still on, and one of them said my name, first and last, and asked if they could have a moment of my time. There was something wrong with the way they stood. Too straight, too symmetrical. I opened the door. They stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, moving in unison, and one of them gestured toward my couch as if it were his own living room. We all sat down. The one on the left did all the talking. He asked me about the video. I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't posted it anywhere. I'd only shown it to my friend, and even then, just a glimpse on my phone screen in the break room. He asked if I still had the file. I said yes. He suggested very politely that I delete it. He said it in a way that didn't feel like a threat, but I understood it was not optional. The other man never spoke. He just watched me. His eyes were dark, too dark, and they didn't reflect the light from the window. I noticed his suit didn't wrinkle where he sat. It stayed smooth like fabric pulled over something rigid. I deleted the video while they watched. I showed them the empty trash folder. The first man smiled and thanked me. They both stood at the same time and left without another word. When I closed the door, I realised the apartment smelled faintly of something chemical, like burnt plastic or ozone. It lingered for hours. They came on a Sunday morning. I was still in my robe, drinking coffee on my porch, when a black sedan pulled into my driveway. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it was being controlled remotely. 2 men got out. They wore identical black suits and narrow-brimmed hats, the kind you don't see anymore. One of them carried a slim leather folder. They walked up my driveway in step with each other, their shoes making no sound on the gravel. The taller one greeted me by name and asked if we could speak privately. I invited them in, though I felt strange doing it, like I was following a script I didn't remember learning. We sat at my kitchen table. The one with the folder opened it and removed a photograph. It was a picture I had taken 3 weeks earlier, at night, of a disc-shaped craft hovering above a field near my house. I had uploaded it to a UFO forum under a pseudonym. No face, no location, no identifying details. But here it was, printed on glossy paper, sitting on my kitchen table. He asked me where I'd taken the photograph. I told him. He asked if I'd shown it to anyone else. I said no, which was true. He slid the photo back into the folder and told me that I'd documented something that didn't exist. He said it calmly, without irony. I started to argue, but he raised one hand, just slightly, and I stopped. The gesture wasn't aggressive, it was gentle, almost sad. He said that if I continued to share images or stories, I would be contacted again, and the conversation would be less pleasant. They left the same way they arrived, in perfect silence. The car reversed out of my driveway without the engine noise changing pitch, and then they were gone. I went back to the forum that night to delete my post, but it was already gone. My entire account had been removed. No trace. I never took another photograph. I was 17 when it happened. My parents were out of town and I was alone in the house, which was unusual. I'd seen something 2 nights before, something I couldn't explain, and I'd made the mistake of calling a local news station to report it. They didn't take me seriously, but someone must have been listening. The knock came around 10 in the evening. I opened the door and found a man standing under the porch light, hands clasped in front of him, head slightly bowed. He was younger than I expected. Maybe 30, maybe 50. It was hard to tell. His face was smooth, but his eyes looked old. He asked if my parents were home. I said no. He asked if he could come in anyway. I should have said no, I should have closed the door, but I didn't. He stepped inside and walked directly to the living room, as if he'd been there before. He sat in my father's chair and looked at me for a long time without speaking. Finally, he asked me to describe what I'd seen. I did, haltingly, suddenly unsure of my own memory. He listened without interrupting, his face blank. When I finished, he told me that I had mistaken a weather balloon for something extraordinary. He said it with the kind of patience you'd use with a child. I wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He stood, smoothed his jacket, and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned and told me that if I spoke about this again, someone would come back. He didn't say who. He didn't have to. Then he was gone, and I locked the door and sat on the floor in the hallway until my parents came home the next day. I never told them. Chapter 2. The Interviewer. I agreed to meet him because he called me at work, on a line that wasn't listed anywhere. He knew my schedule. He knew I'd be alone in the office after 6. He said he was from a research group studying atmospheric anomalies, and that my report had been flagged for follow-up. He sounded official, courteous, and I thought maybe this was finally someone who would take it seriously. We arranged to meet at a diner near my house. Neutral ground, I thought. Public. He was already seated when I arrived, in a booth near the back facing the door. He stood when he saw me, a small formal gesture, and shook my hand. His grip was cold and dry, like shaking hands with a mannequin. He ordered coffee but never drank it. I ordered the same. We sat across from each other, and he opened a small notebook, the kind with a black cover and no branding, and he began to ask questions. At first they were normal. What time did I see the object? What direction was it moving? How long did the sighting last? But then the questions became more specific. He asked what I had been thinking about in the moments before I looked up. He asked if I'd dreamed about flying recently. He asked if anyone in my family had ever reported seeing something unusual. The questions felt scripted, like he was reading from a diagnostic manual, and his pen never touched the paper. He just held it, poised, as if the act of writing was only a formality. I started to feel uncomfortable. I asked him who he worked for exactly. He smiled and repeated the name of the research group. But when I asked for a card or a website, he said they preferred to keep a low profile. He said it without irony, as if that were a reasonable answer. I told him I needed to leave. He didn't argue. He closed the notebook, stood, and thanked me for my cooperation. Then he said something I still think about. He said, "You'll find that memory is more fragile than you think." And he left. I sat there for another 10 minutes trying to remember exactly what I'd told him, and I couldn't. The details were already blurring. When I got home, I tried to write everything down, but whole sections of the conversation were just gone, like trying to remember a dream hours after waking. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, but I knew better. The interview happened in my own home, which made it worse somehow. They called ahead, which was unusual from what I'd read. A polite voice on the phone, asking if they could visit to clarify some details about an incident I'd reported to a UFO hotline weeks earlier. I was curious, maybe even a little excited. I thought I was going to be part of something official. I said yes. 2 men arrived exactly on time. They wore dark suits, white shirts, thin ties. One carried a briefcase, the other a leather portfolio. They introduced themselves with names I forgot immediately, syllables that didn't quite stick. We sat in my dining room and they arranged their materials on the table with great care, everything aligned, everything precise. The one with the briefcase asked if I minded being recorded. I said I didn't. He placed a small device on the table, older looking, with 2 reels. He pressed a button and a faint hum filled the room. The questions started simply: date, time, location. Then they became invasive. They asked about my medical history, my relationships, whether I'd ever experienced missing time, whether I'd ever felt watched. I answered because I didn't know how to stop. The one with the portfolio took notes in handwriting so small and precise it looked mechanical. He never looked up. After an hour, maybe more, they stopped. The one with the recorder clicked it off and packed it away. They thanked me for my time and told me that my account would be filed appropriately. I asked when I might hear back. They didn't answer. They simply stood, collected their things, and left. I walked them to the door and watched as they got into a black car with no license plate. I'm certain of that. No plate at all. Later that night, I tried to remember what I'd said, and I couldn't. Whole sections were missing. I remembered their faces, their suits, the hum of the recorder, but not my own words. It felt like something had been lifted out of me. I stopped reporting sightings after that. He called himself an investigator, though he never said for whom. He contacted me through an email address I'd used once years ago to submit a sighting to an online database. The email was brief, professional. It asked if I would be willing to answer a few questions in person, at my convenience. I was hesitant, but also intrigued. I suggested a coffee shop. He agreed. He was waiting when I arrived, seated at a table near the window, his back to the wall. He looked like every other man in a suit. Unremarkable, but something about him made people look away. He had that effect. When I sat down, he didn't smile, didn't offer small talk. He just began. The questions were strange. He asked if I'd felt compelled to look up at the moment I saw the craft. He asked if I'd told anyone before I told the database. He asked if I'd noticed any electronics malfunctioning in the days that followed. I answered honestly, because the questions suggested he already knew. He took no notes. He just watched me, his eyes unblinking, his expression neutral. At one point I asked him directly, "Are you with the government?" He paused, then said, "Does it matter?" The way he said it made me feel foolish for asking. He continued with his questions for another 20 minutes, then abruptly stood, thanked me, and left. No handshake, no closing remarks. He simply walked out. I sat there afterward, staring at my coffee, trying to process what had just happened. A woman at the next table leaned over and asked if I was all right. I said yes. She said, "That man gave me the creeps." He didn't blink once. I hadn't realised anyone else had been watching. The interview was conducted in a hotel conference room, which should have been my first warning. They'd contacted me through a letter, typewritten, delivered to my home address with no return label. The letter said that my recent report had been selected for in-depth review and that I was invited to participate in a formal debriefing. It gave a date, a time and a room number. It felt official. I went. The room was small, windowless, with a table and 3 chairs. 2 men were already inside when I arrived. They stood when I entered, a synchronized movement, and gestured for me to sit. One of them locked the door behind me. I didn't like that, but I stayed. They asked the same question over and over, phrased slightly differently each time. What did you see? Describe the object. What did you see? Walk me through it again. What did you see? It felt like a test, like they were waiting for me to contradict myself. I kept my answers consistent, but the repetition wore me down. My own memory started to feel unreliable under that kind of scrutiny. After what felt like hours, they stopped. One of them slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a statement, already typed, summarising what I'd seen. But the details were wrong. Subtle changes. The shape was different. The time was off. I pointed this out. The man said, "This is what you reported." I said it wasn't. He insisted. I signed it anyway. I don't know why, I just wanted to leave. They let me go without another word. I walked out of the hotel into bright sunlight and realised I couldn't remember how long I'd been inside. My watch had stopped. When I got home, I found the original report I'd written, and it matched the paper they'd given me, not my memory. I don't know what to trust anymore. Chapter 3. The photograph. I took the picture on a disposable camera, which probably saved me from losing it entirely. This was before smartphones, before everything was backed up and traceable. I was hiking alone in the mountains early morning, and I saw it hovering between 2 peaks. Silent. Massive. I took 3 photos, advanced the film, kept walking. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. When I finally developed the roll, only one of the 3 pictures came out. The other 2 frames were blank, just white, like they had been exposed to light. But the third one was clear, unmistakable. I made copies at a print shop, and I kept the negatives in a safe deposit box. I felt paranoid doing it, but I was right to. They came 4 days later. 2 men, black suits, no appointment. They knocked and I opened the door and they were already holding a copy of my photograph. Not one of the copies I'd made. The original print. The one I kept in a drawer in my bedroom. I didn't ask how they got it, I just stared. They asked where the negative was. I lied and said I'd thrown it away. One of them smiled, a tight, joyless expression, and said, "We'd like to believe you." The other man walked past me into my apartment without asking. I should have stopped him, but I didn't. He went directly to my bedroom, opened the drawer, and removed the envelope with the other prints. He brought them back to the living room and placed them on my coffee table. Then he took out a lighter and burned them, one by one, right there in front of me. I watched the images curl and blacken. When he was finished, they asked again about the negative. I gave them the name of the bank. They thanked me and left. I went to the bank the next day, and the box was empty. The clerk had no record of anyone accessing it, but it was empty. I stopped carrying a camera after that. I recorded it on video, about 40 seconds of footage. Shaky but clear. A triangular craft, low over the rooftops, no sound. I uploaded it to a video sharing site. Unlisted, no description, just to have it somewhere outside my own device. I didn't share the link with anyone, not a soul. 3 days later, I got an email from an address I didn't recognise. The subject line was just my username on the site. The message said, "We've reviewed your video. We'd like to discuss it. Please call." There was a phone number. I didn't call. I deleted the email. That night, someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw a man in a black suit, hands folded, standing perfectly still under the porch light. I didn't open the door. He knocked again. The same rhythm. The same pressure. Then he spoke through the door. He said my name and asked me to let him in so we could talk about the video. I stayed silent. After a long pause, he slid something under the door. A printed screenshot of the video, timestamp visible. Then I heard footsteps, a car door, and he was gone. I took the video down immediately. I deleted my account. I wiped my phone, but I kept the screenshot. I don't know why. Maybe as proof that it happened. Maybe to remind myself that I wasn't safe just because I stayed quiet. The photograph was in a drawer for 6 years before I showed it to anyone. I'd taken it at a family reunion, just a casual snapshot of my cousin standing in the yard. And when I got the film developed, there it was in the background. a metallic disc partially obscured by a tree but undeniable. I kept it to myself. I didn't want to be that person. But eventually I told a friend, someone I trusted, and I showed him the photo. He was sceptical, which I expected, but he was also fascinated. He asked if he could make a copy. I said no. He asked again a week later. I said no again. A month after that, I came home and found my front door unlocked. Nothing was missing except the photograph. I knew immediately. I called my friend and asked if he'd taken it. He swore he hadn't. I believed him, but it didn't matter. 2 days later, a man in a dark suit came to my workplace. He asked to speak with me privately. We went outside. He handed me an envelope. Inside was the photograph, along with the negative, neatly cut from the roll. He said, "This belongs to you. Please keep it that way." I asked how he found me. He didn't answer. I asked who he worked for. He said it wasn't important. Then he left, and I stood there holding the envelope, feeling like I'd been given a warning I didn't fully understand. I burned the photo that night. I don't know why I felt I had to, but I did. I kept a journal of every sighting I'd ever had, detailed entries with sketches and dates. It was a small notebook, nothing fancy, and I carried it everywhere. I'd been doing it for years. When I finally saw something I couldn't dismiss, something too close and too clear, I wrote 5 pages about it. I drew what I'd seen. I noted the exact time and location. I felt like I was documenting history. I didn't show anyone, but I mentioned it online, vaguely in a forum. I didn't use my real name or give specifics, just had the encounter of a lifetime. Finally wrote it all down. Someone replied asking if I'd share it. I said maybe someday. A week later I was sitting in a park reading, and a man sat down on the bench next to me. He was wearing a black suit despite the heat, and he placed a briefcase on his lap. He didn't say anything at first. Then, without looking at me, he said, "Journals can be dangerous." I turned to look at him. He was staring straight ahead. He said, "Especially when they contain things that others would prefer to remain private." I asked him what he meant. He opened the briefcase, and inside was my journal. I felt my stomach drop. It had been in my apartment, in a locked drawer. He closed the briefcase and stood up. "Memories are safer when they stay inside," he said. Then he walked away, taking the journal with him. I never kept a written record again. I tried once or twice, but I couldn't do it. The idea of putting anything on paper felt like an invitation. Chapter 4. The Motel Room. The motel was one of those roadside places that barely existed. A single strip of rooms with a flickering vacancy sign, and a parking lot full of potholes. I'd been driving for 12 hours and I needed to sleep. I checked in, paid cash, and the clerk handed me a key attached to a plastic tag with the room number embossed in fading gold. Room 11. I parked in front of my door and carried my bag inside. The room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning solution. The bedspread was thin and patterned with shapes that might have been flowers. I dropped my bag, locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed. That's when I noticed the car. It was parked 3 spaces down, a black sedan, perfectly clean despite the dust covering every other vehicle in the lot. The interior was dark. I couldn't see if anyone was inside, but I felt watched. I closed the curtain and lay down, but I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, there was a knock. I didn't answer. The knock came again, soft, persistent. A man's voice said my name through the door. Not a question, a statement. He said he'd like to speak with me about an incident I'd reported 2 years ago. 2 years. I'd almost forgotten it myself. I stayed silent. He knocked one more time. Then I heard footsteps, a car door, and the sound of an engine that hummed more than it rumbled. I looked through the curtain, and the car was gone. I left before sunrise. I didn't check out. I just got in my car and drove, and I didn't stop until I was 3 states away. It was late autumn, and I pulled into a rest stop just after midnight. I wasn't tired, just needed to stretch my legs and use the restroom. The rest stop was nearly empty, just a couple of trucks idling in the far corner, and one other car, a black sedan, parked near the entrance under a light that flickered every few seconds. I went inside, used the restroom, bought a coffee from a vending machine that took 5 tries to accept my $1. When I came back out, there was a man standing beside my car. He wore a black suit and a narrow tie, and his face was pale in the fluorescent light. He asked if I had a moment. I said I didn't. He asked again politely, and I felt something inside me give way. I said yes. We stood there in the parking lot and he asked me about something I'd seen 3 weeks earlier. Lights over a highway, moving in formation. I'd told one person, a co-worker, in passing. I hadn't filed a report, I hadn't posted online, but here was this man, at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, asking me about it like he'd been waiting. I described what I'd seen. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded in front of him. When I finished, he thanked me and suggested I keep the memory to myself. He said it kindly, almost paternally, like he was giving me advice for my own good. Then he walked back to the black sedan and drove away. I stood there drinking cold vending machine coffee and watching his taillights disappear. The motel was in Nevada, somewhere between towns, a place you wouldn't stop unless you had to. I had to. My car was overheating and I needed to wait until morning to find a mechanic. I checked in and the woman at the desk barely looked at me. She slid a key across the counter and pointed toward the far end of the building. The room was standard, drab. A bed, a chair, a television bolted to the dresser. I turned on the TV just for the noise and lay down. Around midnight, I heard a car pull up outside, slow and deliberate. I looked through the curtain and saw a black car, sleek and dark, parked directly in front of my room. The driver's side door opened and a man stepped out, black suit, white shirt. He walked to my door and knocked. I didn't move. He knocked again and said my name. He said it calmly like we'd arranged to meet. I stayed quiet. He waited for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, completely still. Then he said, through the door, "We know what you saw in Phoenix. We'd like to hear it from you." Phoenix was 4 years ago, a sighting I'd reported to a local news station that never followed up. I'd forgotten about it until that moment. I heard him walk away, heard the car door close, heard the engine start. When I finally looked out, the car was gone. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the window until the sun came up. I was staying at a motel off Route 40, just passing through, one night on my way to visit family. I checked in late, parked in front of my room, and carried my bag inside. The room was cold and smelled faintly of mildew. I turned up the heat and got ready for bed. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate, stopping right in front of my room. I held my breath. A shadow passed across the gap under the door, back and forth, like someone pacing. Then a soft knock. I didn't answer. Another knock, patient, almost gentle. A man's voice said, "We'd like to speak with you." I didn't recognise the voice. I asked who it was. The voice repeated, "We'd like to speak with you about your experience." I told him to go away. There was a long pause, then I heard him say quietly, as if to someone else, "Not ready." Footsteps moved away. I heard a car door close and an engine start, smooth and nearly silent. In the morning I asked the clerk if anyone had been asking about me. She said no. I described the man. She shook her head. I left and I've never stayed at a roadside motel since. Chapter 5. The Archive. The letter was found in an estate cell, tucked inside a book about aviation. It was handwritten, dated 1987, addressed to no one. The handwriting was shaky but legible. I am writing this because I don't know who else to tell. 3 men came to my house today. They wore black suits and they knew my name. They asked about the thing I saw last month over the reservoir. I don't know how they knew, I only told my wife. They sat in my living room and asked me questions for over an hour. When they left, I couldn't remember half of what I'd said. My wife says I seemed different after they left. I feel different. I don't want to see them again. The letter ended there. No signature. The book was purchased by a researcher who sent the letter to a UFO archive, where it sits now among thousands of similar documents. A voicemail was left on a hotline in 2003. The recording's poor quality, but the voice is clear. I'm calling because I don't know what else to do. 2 men came to my office today and asked to speak to me. They said they were from a federal agency, but they wouldn't show identification. They took me into a conference room and asked me about something I reported 6 months ago. I thought it had been dismissed. They asked very specific questions, things I hadn't included in my report. They knew details I'd kept to myself. When I asked how they knew, they didn't answer. They just thanked me and left. I feel like I'm being watched now. I don't know if I should be scared or if I'm being paranoid. I just needed to tell someone. The voicemail was transcribed and filed. No follow-up was ever made. A diary entry from 1995, found in a storage unit in Oregon. They came again today. Same two men, same black car. They asked the same questions they asked last time, as if testing to see if my answers would change. I told them everything I remembered, which is less than it was before. They didn't seem surprised. One of them told me that memory is unreliable, that I shouldn't trust my own recollection. I wanted to argue, but he said it so calmly that I started to doubt myself. After they left, I tried to write down everything that happened, but I couldn't. The details keep slipping away. I'm writing this now, while I still can. The diary was donated to an archive by a family member who found it after the author's death. The entries stop shortly after this one. A typed statement, undated, found in a filing cabinet in a closed government office. I was visited by two men who identified themselves as investigators. They did not say what they were investigating. They asked me to recount an incident I witnessed in 1972. I did so to the best of my ability. They took notes but did not record the conversation. When I asked for their names again, they repeated them. But I immediately forgot. I cannot explain this. They left after 30 minutes and I have not heard from them since. I am submitting this statement, in case it is of use to anyone trying to understand what is happening. The statement was filed with no additional context. The name of the person who wrote it has been redacted. A transcript of a phone call made to a UFO research organisation in 1998. I'm calling because I was told you might be able to help. I saw something last year and I reported it. A few weeks ago, two men showed up at my house. They said they were following up on my report. They asked me questions for a long time, over an hour, and they took notes, but then they asked me to sign something saying I'd made a mistake, that I'd misidentified a plane. I told them I knew what I saw. They said it would be easier for everyone if I signed. I didn't want to, but I did. I don't know why. I feel like I was pressured, but they were so polite. I'm scared. I don't know if I did the right thing. The call was logged, but no action was taken. The caller did not provide a name. A fragment of a letter found in a desk drawer in an abandoned house in New Mexico. I don't know if anyone will read this, but I have to write it down. The men who came to my house were not normal. I know how that sounds, but they weren't. Their skin was too smooth. Their voices were too even. They asked me questions about things I saw, things I've tried to forget. And the more I answered, the more I felt like I was losing something. When they left, I couldn't remember their faces. I tried to draw them, and I couldn't. I sat at this desk for an hour and I couldn't picture them. I only remember the suits, the black suits, and the feeling that I was not supposed to talk about any of this ever again. The letter breaks off mid-sentence. The rest of the page is blank. Chapter 6. The disappearance. My brother called me on a Tuesday night and said he'd been interviewing people who claimed to have been visited by men in black. He sounded excited, energised in a way I hadn't heard in years. He said he was onto something, that the patterns were too consistent to be coincidence. He said he was going to compile everything and publish it, maybe write a book. I told him to be careful. He laughed and said I was being paranoid. That was the last time I spoke to him. He stopped answering his phone 2 days later. I drove to his apartment and found it unlocked. Everything was there, his laptop, his notes, his wallet. But he was gone. I called the police. They filed a report. They said he'd probably turn up. He didn't. A week later, I went through his apartment more carefully. I found a notebook under his mattress, filled with names and dates and descriptions of encounters. The last entry was dated the night before he disappeared. It said, 2 men in a black car have been parked outside for 3 hours. I think they're waiting for me. That was all. I gave the notebook to the police. They looked through it and handed it back. They said it wasn't evidence of anything. I kept it for a year, then I burned it. I don't know why, I just felt like I had to. She was a journalist, a friend of a friend, and she'd been working on a story about government cover-ups related to UFO sightings. She'd interviewed dozens of witnesses, compiled documents, filed Freedom of Information requests. She was meticulous. She told me once, over coffee, that she'd been retry. Continue. Edit. Followed. She said a black car had been parked outside her building for days and that she'd received calls from a man who knew details about her investigation that she hadn't shared publicly. I told her to drop it. She said she couldn't. She said she was too close. That was in March. In April, she stopped returning emails. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I went to her apartment and the landlord said she'd moved out suddenly, paid the rest of her lease in cash and left no forwarding address. I asked if anyone had come asking for her. He said yes. 2 men in suits. They'd asked the same question. I tried to find her through mutual friends, through social media, through every channel I could think of. Nothing. It was like she'd been erased. Her articles were still online, but her byline had been removed from the one about UFOs. The text was identical, but her name was gone. I saved copies of everything I could find, but I've never tried to contact her again. I'm afraid of what it might mean if I did. His name was Marcus, and he ran a website dedicated to documenting men in black encounters. He collected stories, cross-referenced details, built timelines. He was careful, sceptical, and thorough. He didn't believe everything he heard, but he believed something was happening. We corresponded by email for almost a year. In his last message to me, he said he'd been contacted by someone claiming to have inside information, someone who wanted to meet. He said it felt off, but he was going to do it anyway. He asked me to check in if I didn't hear from him within 48 hours. I said I would. 48 hours passed. I sent an email. No response. I called. Voicemail. I waited another week and then I contacted the police in his city. They told me no missing person report had been filed. I explained the situation. They said they'd look into it. I never heard back. His website went dark a month later. The domain expired and was bought by someone else. I saved what I could before it disappeared, but I never tried to continue his work. I didn't want to become another name on someone else's list. I found her journal in a used bookstore, tucked inside a stack of old notebooks being sold for $1 each. I didn't notice it at first. It wasn't until I got home and started flipping through them that I found the entries. They were dated from 2 years ago, written in tight, nervous handwriting. She described seeing something in the sky while camping, something that hovered silently and then shot away at impossible speed. She wrote about reporting it to a local UFO group and then, a week later, being visited by 2 men who asked her not to discuss it further. She wrote that she agreed, but that she couldn't stop thinking about it. She started researching, reading everything she could find about similar encounters. The entries became more paranoid. She wrote about being followed, about strange phone calls, about cars parked outside her house at odd hours. She wrote that she was going to stop, that it wasn't worth it. But then the next entry would describe another lead, another piece of the puzzle. The last entry was brief. They were outside again. I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to ask them who they are and what they want. I'm tired of being afraid. The rest of the pages were blank. I tried to find out who she was, using details from the journal, but I couldn't. No name, no clear location. Just a record of someone who asked the wrong questions. He was my uncle, my mother's brother, and he'd been obsessed with UFOs since before I was born. He had boxes of files, newspaper clippings, photographs, letters. He attended conferences, gave talks, wrote articles for niche magazines. He was harmless, eccentric, the kind of person family members smiled about but didn't take seriously. The last time I saw him, he told me he'd been contacted by someone who claimed to have proof, real proof, documents, photographs, testimony from someone on the inside. He said he was going to meet them, that this could be the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. I didn't think much of it. He was always chasing breakthroughs. 2 weeks later, my mother got a call from a hospital 3 states away. He'd been found unconscious in a motel room. No identification, no wallet, no luggage. He'd been registered under a false name. When he woke up, he didn't remember how he got there. He didn't remember the meeting. He didn't remember the person who contacted him. The doctors said it might be a stroke or trauma or a psychiatric episode. He came home, but he was different, quieter. He stopped talking about UFOs. He stopped writing. He packed up his files and threw them away. I asked him once what happened. He looked at me for a long time and then said, "I don't want to remember." I didn't ask again. A woman named Claire used to call into a radio show I listened to. Late night, the kind of programme that took calls from anyone with a strange story. She called regularly, always calm, always detailed, describing encounters and sightings, and the men who came afterward. She never sounded scared. She sounded resigned. The last time she called, she said she'd been contacted again. She said they'd asked her to stop calling the show, to stop telling her stories, but that she couldn't. She said she needed people to know. The host asked her what she was going to do. She said she didn't know. She said maybe it was time to disappear for a while, go somewhere they couldn't find her. The host wished her luck. She never called again. I listened for months, waiting to hear her voice, but she was gone. I tried to find information about her, but Claire was a common name, and I didn't know her last name or where she lived. I asked the radio host once through an email if he'd heard from her. He said no. He said a lot of people stopped calling eventually. He didn't sound concerned. I still listen sometimes, hoping she'll come back. She never has. Chapter 7. The Return. I saw him in a coffee shop last year, sitting alone near the window. He was wearing a black suit, same style as before, narrow lapels, thin tie. I recognised him immediately, even though it had been 15 years since he came to my house. He was older, but not much. His face was smooth, ageless in a way that didn't make sense. I thought about leaving. I should have left. But I walked over and asked if I knew him. He looked up at me, no recognition in his eyes, and said, "I don't believe so." I described the night he visited me. He smiled politely and said I must be mistaking him for someone else. I insisted. I described his car, his questions, the way he held his briefcase. He stood, placed money on the table and said, "I hope you have a pleasant day." Then he left. I followed him outside. He got into a black car, the same kind of car, and drove away. I tried to get the license plate, but there wasn't one, just a blank space where it should have been. I went home and looked through old journals, trying to confirm my memory, and I found that I'd written about the encounter, but I'd never described his face. Just the suit. Just the feeling. I saw one on a security camera at my office. I work late sometimes and I review the footage when I'm checking the building before I leave. Last month, I noticed a figure standing in the parking lot, just beyond the range of the lights. Black suit standing completely still, facing the camera. I watched for 10 minutes of footage. He didn't move, not once. I went back through the recordings from previous nights. He was there on 3 other occasions, always in the same spot, always motionless. I showed the footage to my supervisor. He watched it and said it was probably just someone waiting for a ride. I asked him to look at the timestamp, 4 a.m. He shrugged. I saved the footage on a thumb drive and took it home. A week later I checked the recordings again. The figure was gone, but all the files from the nights I'd seen him had been corrupted. Just static. The thumb drive at home was blank. I stopped working late after that. They're always in the background now. I see them at the grocery store, standing near the entrance, watching. I see them at the gas station, sitting in parked cars. I see them on the street when I'm walking my dog, standing on corners, never moving. They don't approach, they just watch. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was imagining patterns that weren't there. But then I started noticing them in other people's photos. Friends would post pictures from parties, from trips, from random moments, and there they'd be in the background. A man in a black suit, slightly out of focus, always facing the camera. I mentioned it to a friend once. She looked at me like I was crazy. She said she didn't see anyone. I pointed to the figure in the background of one of her vacation photos. She squinted at it and said it was probably just a tourist. I zoomed in. The face was blurred like it had been smudged, but the suit was clear. Black. Pressed. Perfect. I don't take pictures anymore. I don't want to know how many of them are watching. I was on a subway train, late evening, almost empty. I was sitting near the back reading on my phone when the train stopped at a station and a man got on. Black suit, white shirt, black tie. He sat down directly across from me, even though there were dozens of empty seats. He didn't look at me. He just sat there, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead. I felt my chest tighten. I tried to ignore him, but I could feel his presence, the wrongness of it. The train started moving again. We rode in silence for 3 stops. Then, without looking at me, he said, "You should be more careful about what you share online." I looked up. He was still staring straight ahead. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. The train stopped at the next station, and he stood up, walked to the doors, and stepped off. I watched through the window as he stood on the platform, motionless as the train pulled away. I deleted all my social media accounts that night. I saw one at my son's school. It was parent-teacher night, and I was walking to my car when I noticed a man standing near the playground. Black suit, hands clasped behind his back, watching the building. I stopped. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at me. We made eye contact for what felt like a full minute. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the building. I went back inside and asked the principal if there had been any security issues. She said no. I described the man. She said she hadn't seen anyone matching that description. I walked around the building, looking for him, but he was gone. The next day I mentioned it to another parent. She said she'd seen someone similar, a few weeks earlier, standing in the same spot. She said she'd reported it, but nothing came of it. We compared notes, same suit, same posture, same unsettling stillness. I started picking my son up early after that. I didn't want him near that playground. They show up in my dreams now. Not every night, but often enough. I'll be in a familiar place, my childhood home, my office, a restaurant I used to visit, and they'll be there, standing in doorways, sitting at tables, always in black suits, always watching. I try to speak to them and I can't. The words won't come. I wake up with my heart pounding and the feeling that I've forgotten something important. I mentioned it to my therapist. She said it sounded like anxiety, unresolved trauma, the mind's way of processing fear. I didn't tell her the rest. I didn't tell her that sometimes I see them when I'm awake too. Flashes, glimpses, a figure in a suit turning a corner just as I look up, a face in a crowd that vanishes when I focus on it. I don't know if they're real or if I've imagined them for so long that they've become real. I don't know if there's a difference anymore. Chapter 8. The Quiet Explanation. I've thought about it for years, turned it over in my mind like a stone worn smooth by water, and I keep coming back to the same question. What are they? Not who, what. Because the more I remember, or think I remember, the less human they seem. The suits, the cars, the script-like precision of their questions. It feels rehearsed, performed, like something mimicking the idea of an investigator without understanding what an investigator actually is. Maybe they're human. Maybe they work for some agency so compartmentalised that even they don't know who they really answer to. Maybe they've been doing this so long that they've become the role, worn it like a mask until the mask and the face are indistinguishable. That would explain the sameness, the uniformity, the sense that you're talking to a template rather than a person. Or maybe they're not human at all. Maybe they're something else, something that learned to walk among us by studying us from a distance, getting the details almost right but not quite. The unblinking eyes, the too smooth skin, the cars with no license plates, the questions that suggest knowledge no one should have. Maybe they're observers, monitors, keepers of a boundary we're not supposed to cross. I don't know. I lie here at night and I think about it, and I don't know. All I know is that once you've seen them, once you've sat across from them and felt the wrongness, you carry it with you. You look at every dark car a little longer. You notice when someone stands too still. You remember that there are things we're not supposed to talk about, and that someone, or something, is making sure we don't. My theory, for what it's worth, is that they're a psychological phenomenon. Not that they're not real, I believe the people who say they've seen them, but that they're a manifestation of guilt, fear, the mind's way of externalising the anxiety that comes from witnessing something you're not supposed to witness. You see something impossible, something that breaks your understanding of the world, and your mind creates an enforcer, a figure to contain that experience, to give you a reason to stay silent. The suits, the questions, the warnings, they're all symbols, authority, anonymity, control. We dress our fears in black suits because that's what authority looks like to us, has always looked like. The men in black are the internalised voice that says, you shouldn't have seen that, you shouldn't talk about it, forget. But then I think about the photographs that disappeared, the security footage that corrupted, the people who went missing. And I wonder if I'm wrong, if it's easier to believe in a psychological explanation than to accept that there are forces, human or otherwise, actively working to suppress this information. Maybe the psychological theory is itself a kind of cover, a way to dismiss the accounts without addressing what they might mean. I don't have an answer. I just have the memory of a man in a black suit who came to my door, and the feeling that I wasn't supposed to remember him at all. I think they're part of a control system, something vast and old, designed to manage what we're allowed to know. Not government exactly, though maybe they work alongside governments. Or through them. Something older, something that's been here as long as we have or longer, maintaining a boundary between the known and the unknown. Every culture has stories like this, figures who appear after encounters with the divine, the supernatural, the otherworldly. Figures who warn, who threaten, who enforce silence. We call them men in black now because that's the language we have. But the pattern is ancient. Someone sees something they shouldn't, and someone else makes sure they don't spread it too far. Maybe it's protective. Maybe we're not ready for what's on the other side of that boundary, and they're keeping us from crossing it too soon. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they're keeping us contained, keeping us from understanding something that would change everything. Either way, they're gatekeepers. I've made my peace with not knowing which. I saw what I saw. They came, they asked their questions. I answered. And now I live with the knowledge that there are limits to what I'm allowed to explore. Invisible lines I can feel even if I can't see them. It's not comforting, but it's stable. It's a kind of equilibrium. Sometimes late at night I think they're us. Future versions of ourselves or alternate versions, coming back to manage the timeline, to prevent paradoxes or disruptions. The UFOs are ours too, craft from a future we haven't reached yet, and the men in black are clean-up crews, making sure the past doesn't learn too much too soon. It would explain the near-human appearance, the slight wrongness. They're us but changed, adapted to a different environment or a different time. It would explain why they know so much, why they're always one step ahead. They have records, databases. They know who saw what and when, because it's already happened for them. It sounds like science fiction, and maybe it is. Maybe I'm reaching for an explanation that makes sense, that fits the pattern, because the alternative, that they're completely unknowable, is too unsettling. But I keep coming back to it. The careful way they preserve the timeline, the way they take evidence but don't destroy the witnesses. They're not erasing us, they're editing us, keeping the story on track. I don't know if I believe it, but I think about it. I lie here in the dark and I think about it, and sometimes it helps me sleep. I don't have a theory anymore. I used to. I used to think I could figure it out, connect the dots, find the pattern that would make it all make sense. But the more I learned, the more I talked to others who'd had similar experiences, the more contradictory it all became. Some people said the men were aggressive. Others said they were polite. Some said they were clearly human. Others said they couldn't have been. The stories don't line up except in the broadest strokes, so now I just accept it. I saw something. They came. They asked me not to talk about it. I mostly haven't. That's the whole story. I don't know what they were or what they wanted or whether they were even real in the way we usually understand that word. I just know that the experience was real for me and that it changed how I see the world. There's a comfort in not knowing, in accepting mystery. I don't need an explanation. I don't need closure. I just need to remember that the world is stranger than we're taught, and that sometimes you stumble across a seam in the fabric, a place where the strange shows through, and all you can do is step back and keep quiet and carry it with you. I carry it with me, and most nights that's enough. Chapter 9. The Witness Protection. I met a woman at a conference once, one of those small gatherings for people who'd had experiences they couldn't explain. She didn't give her real name. She said she'd been in witness protection, unofficial witness protection, for almost a decade. Not from criminals, from them. She told me she'd worked as a photographer for a newspaper in the southwest, and she'd been in the right place at the wrong time. She'd photographed something over the desert, a structured craft at low altitude, clear and undeniable in the frame. She'd turned in the role to be developed at the paper, standard procedure, and by the time she got back to her desk, 2 men were waiting in the lobby. They took her to a conference room. They showed her the negatives, all of them, including the ones she hadn't picked up yet. They laid them out on the table like evidence at a trial. Then they offered her a choice. She could agree to stop working as a photographer, move to a different state, and never discuss what she'd seen. Or she could face consequences they didn't specify. They gave her 24 hours to decide. She took the deal. They helped her relocate, helped her find a new job doing administrative work, in an office 3 states away. They checked in periodically, always politely, always just to make sure she was keeping her end of the agreement. She said the visits became less frequent over the years, but they never stopped entirely. Even now, a decade later, she'd see a black car parked outside her apartment sometimes. Just a reminder, she told me all of this in a whisper, looking over her shoulder every few minutes. When I asked why she'd come to the conference if she was supposed to stay quiet, she said she needed to tell someone. Even if she couldn't use her real name, she needed to know she wasn't the only one living like this. After we talked, she left quickly, and I never saw her again. I've thought about her often, wondered if she's still out there, still looking over her shoulder, still keeping the agreement she made in that conference room. I knew someone who claimed they'd been followed for years, not constantly, but periodically, like a check-in. He said it started after he'd testified at a Citizen, hearing about UFOs, given his account publicly, on record. He thought he was being brave, doing his civic duty. A week later they showed up. They didn't threaten him. They didn't tell him to recant. They just wanted him to know they were aware of him, that they'd be watching. And they were. He'd see them at restaurants, always seated several tables away. He'd notice them in parking lots and sitting in cars with the engine off. He'd spot them in crowds, always at a distance, always watching. He started documenting it, taking photos when he could, keeping a log of every sighting. He showed me once a thick binder full of blurry images and dated entries. Most of the photos showed nothing useful. A distant figure, a dark car, sometimes just an empty street where he swore someone had been standing moments before. He said the act of documenting it helped him feel less crazy, gave him a sense of control. But then the binder disappeared. He'd kept it in a locked drawer in his home office, and one day it was just gone. Nothing else was missing. No signs of a break-in. Just the binder. He filed a police report, but they said there was nothing they could do without evidence of forced entry. He tried to recreate it from memory, but most of the details had already started to fade. The last time I saw him, he seemed defeated. He said he'd stopped trying to prove anything. He said he'd learned to live with being watched, that it had become part of his daily routine, like checking the weather or locking the door at night. He said sometimes you just accept that you're living a different kind of life than most people, and you adapt. I don't know if he's still being followed. I don't know if he even notices anymore. There was a support group briefly in the late 90s. Someone had organised it through a UFO newsletter, a way for people who'd been visited by men in black to meet and share their experiences. I went to one meeting. It was held in a library basement, fluorescent lights humming, folding chairs arranged in a circle. There were maybe a dozen of us. We went around the circle, each person sharing their story. The details varied, but the core experience was always the same. A sighting, a visit, a warning, a lingering sense of surveillance. Some people cried, some people laughed. Dark humour as a coping mechanism. Some just sat quietly, nodding along, relieved to be around others who understood. The organiser, a middle-aged man with glasses and a kind face, said he'd been planning to make it a monthly thing. A safe space where we could talk openly without judgment. He'd already reserved the room for the next 3 months. But after that first meeting, something changed. People started cancelling, calling the organiser to say they couldn't make it, that they'd thought better of it, that it wasn't a good idea to gather like this. Within 2 weeks, everyone had backed out. The organiser called me sounding worried. He said he'd received a visit. 2 men, polite but firm, suggesting that the group was unnecessary, that it might cause more harm than good, that people should process these experiences privately. He cancelled the remaining meetings. He stopped publishing the newsletter. When I asked if he was okay, he said he was fine, just tired, ready to move on. But I could hear it in his voice, the resignation, the understanding that some things aren't worth fighting for. I never went to another meeting. I never tried to organise one myself. I learned the lesson they wanted us to learn. Isolation is part of the process. Keep your experience to yourself. Don't build community. Don't compare notes. Stay separate and stay quiet. I spoke to a researcher once who'd spent 20 years collecting accounts of men in black encounters. He had filing cabinets full of letters, transcripts, recorded interviews. He'd travelled all over the country, meeting with witnesses, documenting their stories with meticulous care. He'd written a book, self-published, that laid out the patterns he'd found. The book didn't sell well. It was too dense, too academic, too committed to presenting the data without sensationalising it. But the people who read it found it valuable. They'd write to him, thanking him for taking them seriously, for treating their experiences as worthy of serious investigation. He told me it was the most meaningful work he'd ever done. Then the visits started. Not to the witnesses this time, to him. Men in dark suits showing up at his lectures, sitting in the back row, never asking questions, just watching. Following him to his car afterward, keeping pace a few steps behind. Never approaching but always present. He said it was clearly meant to intimidate, and it worked. He stopped giving lectures. He stopped accepting new interviews. He let the book go out of print and didn't pursue a second edition. When I asked him why, he said he'd reached a point where the cost outweighed the benefit. He'd proven to himself that the phenomenon was real, that the patterns were consistent, that something was happening. He didn't need to prove it to anyone else. But I could tell it hurt him, giving it up. He'd devoted 2 decades to this work, and in the end, he had to walk away from it. He still had the files, he said, locked in a storage unit somewhere. Maybe someday someone would want them. Maybe someday it would be safe to continue the work. But not now. Not while they were watching. I asked him if he regretted any of it. He thought for a long time before answering. Then he said no. He said the work had mattered, even if it had to end this way. He said bearing witness was never wasted effort, even when the witness is forced into silence. The truth exists whether we speak it or not. I think about that sometimes. The idea that the truth persists, regardless of what we do with it. That the experiences are real, the encounters happened, the phenomenon exists, whether we document it or suppress it or simply carry it quietly within us. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be. Chapter 10. The Technology. My laptop started acting strangely about a month after I posted my account on a forum. Programs would open and close on their own. Files would move between folders without me touching them. The cursor would drift across the screen, highlighting text, clicking links, as if someone else were controlling it remotely. I ran every antivirus program I could find. Nothing. I took it to a repair shop and the technician said the hardware was fine. The software was clean. There was no logical explanation for what I was describing. He suggested I was probably just tired, misremembering, but I knew what I'd seen. I started keeping the laptop closed, unplugged, even covered with a cloth, and still I'd find it warm to the touch in the morning, as if it had been running all night. Then came the phone calls. My cell would ring, no number displayed, and when I answered there'd be silence. Not dead air. I could hear something, a faint mechanical hum, like distant machinery. I'd say hello, and the line would disconnect. It happened a dozen times before I stopped answering unknown numbers entirely. One night I woke to find my phone on, screen glowing in the dark, open to the Photos app. It was scrolling through my pictures on its own, slowly, methodically, as if someone were reviewing them one by one. I grabbed it and shut it off, pulled the battery out, and didn't turn it back on for 2 days. When I finally did, dozens of photos were missing. Not deleted, they weren't in the trash folder. Just gone. I mentioned this to someone online, another person who'd had similar experiences, and they told me it was standard. They said the monitoring was part of the process, that once you were flagged, everything you did digitally was subject to review. They said some people had found hidden programs on their devices, sophisticated surveillance tools that left almost no trace. They said the best thing to do was assume everything was being watched and act accordingly. I bought a new laptop. I changed all my passwords. I stopped posting online about anything related to UFOs or Men in Black. But I never felt secure again. Every notification, every unexpected email, every moment when my device did something I didn't initiate, it all felt like evidence of intrusion, of eyes on the other side of the screen, watching everything I did. I had a friend who worked in IT, someone who understood systems and networks better than anyone I knew. When I told him about the strange things happening with my devices, he offered to take a look. He was skeptical, thought it was probably just normal glitches, but he agreed to run a deep diagnostic. What he found disturbed him. He called me late one night, told me to come over immediately, and when I arrived he had my laptop disassembled on his desk, components spread out like an autopsy. He pointed to something on the motherboard, a tiny chip that he said wasn't standard, wasn't part of the original hardware. He said it looked like a monitoring device, something installed after manufacture, probably during a repair or an upgrade. I told him I'd never had it repaired. I'd bought it new directly from the manufacturer. He didn't have an explanation for that. He removed the chip carefully, using tweezers and a magnifying glass, and placed it in a small plastic bag. He said he wanted to analyse it further, figure out what it did, maybe trace where it came from. I never saw him again after that night. He stopped answering my calls. His apartment was cleared out within a week. His lease terminated. No forwarding address. I tried to find him through mutual friends, through his employer, through every channel I could think of. Nothing. He'd vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. The chip vanished too. I'd left it with him, and now it was gone. Along with any proof that it had ever been there. I bought another new laptop, this time keeping it as locked down as possible, never connecting it to public networks, never installing anything I didn't absolutely need. But the paranoia remained. The sense that every device I owned was potentially compromised, that privacy was an illusion, that they could reach through the screen whenever they wanted. There were stories whispered in forums and chat rooms about people who'd tried to use technology against them. Someone who'd set up hidden cameras around their property to catch the men in black on film. Someone who'd installed GPS trackers on the black cars. Someone who'd used encryption and anonymous networks to share information they thought couldn't be traced. None of it worked. The cameras would malfunction at crucial moments, recording nothing but static. The GPS trackers would go offline or lead to empty parking lots. The encrypted messages would be intercepted anyway. The anonymous networks somehow penetrated. It was as if the technology itself was working against us, or they had access to tools so far beyond what we understood that our attempts at security were laughable. I read one account from someone who claimed they'd worked in signals intelligence, someone who understood surveillance at a level most of us couldn't comprehend. They said that if a government agency, or something mimicking one, wanted to monitor you, there was nothing you could do to stop it. Every device you owned was a potential access point. Every network you connected to was compromised. Every communication could be intercepted. They said the best defense wasn't better technology, it was irrelevance. Stop being interesting. Stop investigating. Stop posting. Stop talking. Fade into the background noise of ordinary life until you are no longer worth watching. They said they'd done exactly that. Deleted everything. Abandoned all their research. And moved to a small town where they worked a simple job and kept to themselves. They said they still saw the black cars sometimes, but less frequently now, as if they were being checked on, rather than actively monitored. I don't know if I believe that's possible. I don't know if you can ever truly become irrelevant once you've been noticed. But I understand the appeal. The idea that you could opt out, step back, return to anonymity. Sometimes I think about it. Deleting everything, starting over, pretending none of this ever happened. But then I remember that they already know. They've already catalogued my accounts, my devices, my searches, my communications. The surveillance has already happened. Erasing my digital footprint now won't erase their records. I'm in the system permanently, whether I participate or not. So I live with it. I accept that privacy is gone, that my devices are likely compromised, that anything I do online is potentially observed. It's not comforting, but it's reality. And maybe in some strange way there's freedom in that acceptance. Once you stop trying to hide, once you acknowledge that you're being watched, the fear loses some of its power. Not all of it, but some. Chapter 11. The Others. I've met enough people now to know that I'm not alone, not just in having seen something, and not just in having been visited afterward, but in carrying this specific kind of weight. The weight of knowing something that most people don't believe, and being unable to prove it, and having to live a normal life anyway. We recognise each other sometimes, even without speaking about it directly. There's a look, a wariness, a way of scanning a room before settling into a conversation. We're careful with our words. We avoid certain topics in public. We've learnt to code our experiences in language that sounds mundane, that doesn't draw attention. I met someone at a bookstore once browsing the same section I was. Anomalous phenomena, fringe science, the books most people walk past without noticing. We started talking, carefully at first, about the books we'd read, the theories we found interesting. And then after 20 minutes of careful circling, he said, "Have you ever seen one?" I knew what he meant. I said yes. He nodded. He said, "Did they come after?" I said yes. He nodded again. We didn't need to say anything else. We stood there in the aisle, two strangers who understood each other perfectly, and I felt less alone than I had in years. There's a woman I correspond with occasionally, someone I met through a forum before it was shut down. We don't use our real names. We don't share personal details. But we write to each other about our experiences, the weight of them, the way they've shaped our lives. She told me once that she thinks of us as a dispersed community, scattered across the country, across the world, connected by this shared experience, but deliberately kept separate. She said that's part of the control mechanism. If we never gather, never organise, never compare notes in any systematic way, we remain isolated voices, easily dismissed. But even in isolation, she said, we're not alone. Somewhere out there, someone else is lying awake thinking about the knock at their door. Someone else is checking their rearview mirror for black cars. Someone else is weighing whether to tell their story or keep it hidden. We're all carrying the same burden, even if we carry it separately. I find that comforting sometimes. The idea that across the distance, across the silence, there are others who understand. Others who've sat across from men in black suits and felt the wrongness. Others who've had their evidence disappear, their memories blur, their certainty erode. Others who've chosen to keep living anyway, carrying their experiences quietly, waiting for a time when maybe it will be safe to speak. I wonder sometimes what would happen if we all spoke at once, if every person who had had an encounter, who'd been visited, who'd been warned into silence, decided simultaneously to break that silence. Would they be able to manage all of us? Would the weight of sheer numbers overcome the mechanisms of suppression? Or would it make no difference? Would we speak and be dismissed anyway, our accounts lost in the noise of a world that's already oversaturated with information, where truth and fiction blur together, and nothing feels entirely real? Maybe that's the final control mechanism. Not active suppression, but passive dismissal. The ability to speak freely because no one's really listening anyway. I don't know. I think about it, but I don't know. What I do know is that I've found solace in the small connections. The occasional conversation with someone who understands. The letters exchanged with careful anonymity. The quiet acknowledgement, in a bookstore aisle or a coffee shop, that we're not alone in this. Maybe that's enough. Maybe community doesn't have to mean organisation or public declaration. Maybe it can be this, scattered individuals, maintaining loose connections, offering each other the simple comfort of being believed, of not having to explain or justify or prove, of being able to say, this happened to me, and hearing back, I know, it happened to me too. There's a man I know who's devoted his retirement to listening. He doesn't investigate anymore, doesn't try to prove anything, doesn't publish or lecture or build databases. He just listens. People find him somehow, through word of mouth, through old connections, and they tell him their stories. He listens without judgment, without interruption, and when they're finished, he thanks them. He told me once that bearing witness is a sacred act, that when someone trusts you with their truth, especially a truth that's cost them something, the least you can do is receive it with respect. He said he's heard hundreds of accounts over the years, maybe thousands, and while the details vary, the core is always the same. Contact, visitation, warning, silence. He said he doesn't know what it all means, doesn't claim to have answers, but he knows it means something. He said the pattern is too consistent, too widespread, too persistent to be coincidence or delusion. Something is happening. Something has been happening for a long time. And people need to be able to talk about it, even if only to one person, even if only once. I asked him if he'd ever been visited himself, if the men in black had come for him. He smiled and said yes once, years ago. They'd asked him to stop listening, to stop collecting accounts. He told them he couldn't do that. They'd asked why. He'd said because people needed someone to tell, and if he stopped listening, they'd have no one. They'd left without pressing the issue. He said he didn't know if they had accepted his reasoning or simply decided he wasn't worth the effort. But they'd never come back. He'd continued his work, quietly, without fanfare, and they'd let him. He said maybe there were limits to what even they would suppress. Or maybe they'd calculated that one old man listening to stories was less dangerous than the alternative. People with nowhere to put their truth, no witness to validate their experience, forced to carry it entirely alone. I like to think he's right. I like to think there's something they can't or won't suppress. The simple human need to be heard, to be believed, to have your reality acknowledged by another person. Maybe that's the one thing that persists, no matter how sophisticated the control mechanisms become. The connection between two people when one says, "This is what happened to me," and the other says, "I believe you." In the end, maybe it doesn't matter what they are. The effect is the same. You see something that changes you. and then they appear, and after they leave, you're different, more cautious, more aware of boundaries, visible and invisible. You learn to keep certain experiences to yourself, to recognise when you've wandered into territory that someone or something doesn't want you exploring. That's the real function, I think. Not to erase the experience, but to contain it, to make sure it stays personal, private, a story you might tell in whispers but never shout. And it works. Most of us stay quiet. We go back to our lives. We integrate the experience as best we can, and we move forward, carrying this secret knowledge that we're not alone, that the world is more than we're told, but also that there are consequences for speaking too loudly about it. So we tell our stories carefully, if we tell them at all. We share them in the dark, in forums, in late-night conversations, in recordings like this one. We pass them along like folklore, like warnings, like prayers. And we listen to each other, recognising something familiar in the details, even when the specifics differ. The black suits, the wrong faces, the polite threats, the lingering sense of being watched. We listen and we remember, and we carry these stories forward, not as proof, not as evidence, just as testament, a record of the things we saw, the visits we received, the silence we learned to keep. And maybe that's enough. Maybe bearing witness, even quietly, is its own form of resistance. Or maybe it's exactly what they want. I don't know anymore. I'm tired of guessing. I just know that I saw what I saw, and they came, and I'm still here, still telling this story in the only way I know how. Softly, carefully. In the dark, where it's safe, where we can rest together in the mystery, where we can close our eyes and let it all drift away, at least for now, at least until morning. Sleep well wherever you are. The stories will still be here when you wake.